In 2016, in response to the Trump and Brexit votes, my colleagues and I founded an open access journal called Civic Sociology to bring better sociological knowledge in contact with reality, including the widening political, economic, and cultural gulfs between educated and non-educated populations and regions in advanced industrialized nations. We realized we were similar yet different from public sociology as articulated by Michael Burawoy in 2005, rather than separating a critical applied branch from a more professional detached research. We aimed to integrate all four forms of sociological knowledge and practice through the solving of social problems with local communities. In this lecture, I will work through my thinking on the particular problems facing universities today, including the withdrawal of local engagement identified by the UPP Foundation in 2019. We will begin with my theory of the academization process, or university revolution, in particular with the core paradox or contradiction we find ourselves in at this moment in history. The first phase of the academization process ended after the turn of the 20th century, having begun at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Germany a century earlier. 5 factors caused this transition from medieval to modern elite universities, including class conflict, especially among the middle and upper classes, the displacement of religion, imperialism, particularly intra-imperial competition, and fear of German ascendance, also the changing roles of women and children in society, and lastly, growth of science and technology, including both industrial engineering and philanthropic public health, medical science, and so forth. All of these together led to the repositioning of universities as a central institution in the making of modernity. The emergence of a new class of academics and professionals, what I call the university revolution, gave this class a particular ideology, an anti-elitist elitism. In this communicative system, schooled individuals ground their self-interests in external objective claims while criticizing other elites using the language of our science contrasted against their ideology. This produces a kind of auto-critique, particularly amongst progressive professionals who tie themselves into psychic knots to retain their denial of self-interest while constantly pursuing high-status positions, wealth, and esteem. It's not difficult for humans with eyes to see through these masks, providing ample fuel for less scrupulous politicians and ideologues on the right to shout, "Hypocrisy!" to wide applause. The university becomes a central referent in these ideological conflicts and accordingly becomes the central institution in the global organization of modern ideological power, paradoxically organized around the critique of ideology on both sides. By the mid-20th century, the new class elite of academics, professionals, and civil servants settled around 3 key interests. 1, an economic interest in capitalizing on credentials through higher salaries. 2, a political interest in controlling the conditions of one's own work. And 3, a cultural interest in participating in critical discourse, that is, abstract knowledge-based cultural and linguistic community. There are variations. Consultants might prefer high salaries, while academics might trade pay for cultural esteem. But in general, these 3 interests are characteristic of the new class that starts to consolidate its position in society at the end of the 19th century. Once the link between educational credentials and future social position and income was established, we see a sustained expansion of education and opportunity for individuals, which substitutes for further extension of actual economic, political, or cultural power to these historically excluded groups. So first, middle-class men and women enter elite universities, then working-class men, then minority ethnic populations, until now we see over 50% of the young age cohort in tertiary education. Yet this does not increase social equality. The expansion of a contradictory university system only reinforces inequality, precarity, and inflation. Not simply grade inflation, but actual inflation, when debt, uneven salary growth, and financialization proceed unchecked. The result is generational, regional, and class inequities that will take decades to unravel. We need to start undoing and reconstructing universities and societies now. So, in his talk last month, Chris Newfield highlighted the dual role of universities as a force for both good and ill, which we need to both protect and reform. We are, in fact, at an inflection point between the second phase and a new third era in the long history of the academization process, a university's 3.0, if you will. So, why this interregnum? The core paradox of a massifying university system set up for elites in the 19th century has hit its limits now that 50% of the population is told that they are both elite and not at all special. Such a logic only makes sense in an expanding division of labor, wherein increasing specialization of functions means new graduates find vacant structural holes. Perhaps in some places this functional integration works better than others. German, Scandinavian, maybe Japanese welfare economies come to mind here. But outside of these corporatist states, particularly in English-speaking countries, more and more graduates embody the philosophical fiction that knowledge is a consumer product. And agencies filled with such schooled individuals accredit themselves with certificates and rankings to prove that their knowledge is world-leading, while simultaneously denying the possibility that others might know more than they do on matters of common sense, right and wrong, justified versus unjustified authority, or any other matter of genuine substance. For instance, the climate science necessary to stop the world bursting into flames. The dramatic second phase expansion of the social fund of knowledge therefore hits its limits when channeled through the training and graduation of individuals who then go into job roles that are no longer expanding. This produces a severe disconnect between promises made and actual reality, wherein an overheated job market produces precarity in every direction. Alvin Gouldner called this condition block descendants, which could lead to the radicalization of younger generations who generalize their grievances by finding common cause with other marginalized groups. Meanwhile, our elitist, anti-elitist culture annoys essentially everyone. We infuriate other elites in our contests against one another. Resentment, distrust, and willful obstruction become the blunt weapons of those left behind, outside the elite centers of power and jargony discourses. In particular, older, less well-off, non-credentialed, majority ethnic populations feel estranged from younger, more diverse cohorts who drink strange milks and problematize gender, empire, and throw statues into Bristol Harbor. At present, the electoral numbers are on the side of the elders, such that when the Conservative Party caters to this generation's interests and resentments, we face public withdrawal of public support for higher education, precisely at this pivotal moment. This impoverished higher education is one possible future, perhaps the most likely in the short term. Another possibility involves further differentiation of function, concocted for PowerPoint presentations at the Office for Students, or UUK. These will steer retraining and reskilling for the majority of students while further reinforcing the elitist inequalities at the heart of the system. Though dressed in new lingo around leveling up, such policies would more or less extend the logic of the past 10 to 20 years. Or we can begin articulation of a third possibility I would call civic, whose origins are as deep, if not deeper, than the liberal and social models of education that have produced the contradictory binds we find ourselves in. For at the end of the 19th century, during the transition between universities 1.0 and 2.0, an alternative model and ethic was articulate and institutionalized, particularly in some of the red brick universities, including the Victoria University of Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, Bristol, and so on. Today, we think of these industrial institutions par excellence, but this is mistaken. Civic universities were more precisely bulwarks against spiritless materialism, bourgeois mediocrity, and the unthinking destruction of our social, environmental, and cultural heritage in the name of so-called progress. A starting point for reconstruction of the civic ethic for the 21st century could be found in Matthew Arnold's criticism of Philistinism. Widely misread as a conservative ideologue, since many of his ideas lend support for otherwise conservative or anti-liberal positions, both in his own time as well as afterwards. A closer reading of Arnold's arguments reveals that his core idea was that culture is for everyone, By extension, he was in favor of universal education. He recommended culture as profoundly useful in getting us unstuck from then-present crises. Quote, as the great help out of our present difficulties, culture, being a pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know, on all the matters which most concern us, the best which has been thought and said in the world, and through this knowledge turning a stream of fresh and free thought upon our stock notions and habits, which we now follow staunchly but mechanically, vainly imagining that there is a virtue in following them staunchly, which makes up for the mischief of following them mechanically. So although Arnold defended traditions and elements of classical beauty and aesthetics that would be lost if the barbarian aristocrats were replaced by the middle-class nonconformist Philistines, he was not particularly conservative, but rather iconoclastic and disruptive of the existing way of doing things. Through genuine access and participation in culture, everyone could learn to cast fresh and creative eyes on existing problems and produce sensible and useful solutions to those problems. For example, in the realm of education, he imagined an expansion of culture emanating from a well-resourced center that could progress knowledge, wisdom, and culture more widely than the narrow yet aimless modern curriculum he found while touring the country as chief inspector of schools. Arnold's faith in culture was due to its ontology insofar as culture, unlike economic wealth, was not consumed when redistributed. Thus, providing access and appreciation to human culture meant everyone could participate equally in the fruits and production of civilization. Culture was not exclusive, but empowering, not elitist and useless, but urgent and necessary to tackle societal problems and goals with fresh thinking. As Arnold wrote to his friend Arthur Clough, the complaining millions of men darken and labor in pain. What they want is something to animate and ennoble them, not merely to add zest to their melancholy or grace to their dreams. Instead, the ascendant middle classes smashed the idols while reconstructing a lifestyle and culture which aped what they imagined the aristocracy behaved like. They then presented themselves as the patronizing, charitable caretakers of the poor, offering them their education so the dispossessed or poor might one day be capable of self-government and work in their factories. But Arnold asked a different question directed at his own Philistine middle class. On what basis can you pretend to educate others, to self-govern others, when you are so poor at managing yourselves? Maybe the problem is not the uneducated rabble, but rather the inability of the middle classes to manage the powers they have laid claim to. Arnold's concerns provide a different standpoint from which we can begin to rethink the current crisis of higher education. For what if the problems we face are due to our own failures of imagination, our own inadequacies and latent fears that we may well be going about this all wrong? We are widening access to education, and yet, are we certain we are in fact aware of what it is we are widening access to? Surely, we cannot simply leave such questions unanswered or vaguely defined, for in doing so, we confuse rather than enlighten. We mark unnatural distinctions between education for them versus education for us, culture for them, culture for us. Such banal cowardice encourages an expansive mediocrity. As Nietzsche similarly observed in Germany at the time, the expansion and dissemination of education and knowledge goes hand in hand with the narrowing and weakening of knowledge. For various reasons, education is supposed to reach the widest possible circle, such that the demand of the first tendency. But then, the second tendency expects education to give up its own highest, noblest, loftiest aims and content itself with serving some other form of life, for instance, the state. This condition of anti-education was the result of the state's establishment of mass education as the only means through which one could enter the civil service. The demand for universal education necessitated a broadening of the criteria through which teachers were accredited. This group then redefined and narrowed the definition of culture according to their own sensibilities, producing a more mediocre content, which on the one hand diminished The content of a properly classical education, which Nietzsche and Arnold and others admitted no longer existed, even amongst the philologists. On the other hand, the populace became alienated from their own culture and spirit. All were forced into an equally middling, leveled culture, which was not so much the lowest common denominator, but a contentless purgatory in which everyone was equally dissatisfied and unintimidated, if otherwise powerless and slavish. Sounds a bit like neoliberalism to me. Another contemporary of these thinkers, George Eliot, had a similar perspective vis-a-vis the establishment, which she was both adjacent to and excluded from, in part by her sex, but even more substantially by her untraditional family and religious practices and beliefs. This standpoint gave her thought a particular character that informed her realist social philosophy, her unflinching exploration of social relation, ironies, constraints, and pressures for individuals and groups. Eliot depicted the manner in which women, political radicals, religious dissidents, and other marginalized members of Victorian society were treated, how they managed to preserve some glory and honor, even in their seemingly inevitable failures. Society was thus portrayed as realistically highly problematic, and Eliot's genius was to represent these profound everyday injustices in familiar, compelling, and popular forms. Her relationship to education was complex because her writing was generally oriented toward culture writ large, but her influence was significant on educationalists, including Bishop John Percival, founder of Clifton College and the University of Bristol, and others. As with Arnold, Eliot's position was that of a conservative reformer. She could not abide the status quo, but also saw in the present the legacies of past paths not taken. She recognized that much of our current predicament consisted in the liberal tendency to debase the moral currency. As she put it, this is what I call debasing the moral currency, lowering the value of every inspiring fact and tradition so that it will command less and less of the spiritual products, the generous motives which sustain the charm and elevation of our social existence. The something besides bread by which man saves his soul alive. The breadwinner of the family may demand more and more coppery shillings or assignats or greenbacks for his day's work, and so get the needful quantum of food. But let that moral currency be emptied of its value, let a greedy buffoonery debase all historic beauty, majesty, and pathos, and the more you heap up the desecrated symbols, the greater will be the lack of ennobling emotions which subdue the tyranny of suffering and make ambition one with social virtue. Again, we see in Eliot's social philosophy a rejection of the absolutist utilitarian nonconformist position that we must expand culture at all costs, including the cost of genuine culture itself. This is where I see Eliot, Arnold, Nietzsche, and others articulating a non-liberal basis for education that I'm distinguishing by calling civic. Perhaps later social philosophers might call this communitarian, but as I've written elsewhere in a review of Robert Bellis' Sociology, the so-called liberal communitarian debate of the 1980s was largely the construct of liberal pedants, and there's little in the work of Bella, McIntyre, and related scholars that's fundamentally opposed to liberal tenets like individual rights and so on. The claim is that liberalism does not go anywhere near far enough and becomes contradictory, dysfunctional, and ultimately immoral in practice, or amoral. The greatest weakness of liberal, and including the subspecies neoliberal education, is its capacity to disempower individuals and groups demanding change. Liberalism is a kind of 8-bit representation machine where social justice demands for, say, diversity, decolonization, or inclusion are deemed completed once a sufficient number of representative individuals are staged within the relevant photo op. Further consideration of more radical or indeed conservative demands are deemed too divisive and always set aside until some future time that never comes. But as Stephen Lukes and others demonstrate in their analyses of 3 dimensions of power, decision-making, non-decision-making, and ideological power, often those with the most power are those who get to decide What is discussed? What gets platformed? What is considered evidence? What is allowed to be thought versus what can be dismissed as mere theory? What is considered irrelevant because it has no purchase within the existing scholarly literature? In other words, what are the gatekeeping mechanisms that keep the category of knowledge in tiny specialized boxes, minded by experts who are in fact often enough only the last man standing in a long process of attrition? What if there's a far greater percentage of genuine intellectuals who began their degrees in academia then left, or retired early, or who were bullied out by the more mediocre superiors who saw their refusal to play by the rules as a threat to their mediocre existence? To my mind, these are the questions we need to start asking ourselves. We then need to turn to the question of where can we find these fellows out there in the world? Not simply the future scholars taking A-levels this year or next year, but those adults living happily and successfully with half a PhD. We need to ask them, how can we reform our institutions to no longer crush and grind our brightest stars into dust? Help us to find those adults who found school mindless and dull. Guess what? A lot of it is. In going through such self-reflexive and dialogic discussions with our colleagues, community students, and alumni, we might begin to see things in as fresh a light as Arnold suggests. We might begin to identify those points where we have allowed the moral currency to have been debased. We might begin the process of reconstructing knowledge for everyone, not simply the 50% of young people who score well enough on a narrow test of rote learning. Not even the 100% of young people who might enter higher education, many of whom don't have a genuine interest in doing so at the age of 18. We must begin to reconceive the civic university as genuinely being for all people. Young, old, middle-aged, academic, non-academic, professional, semi-skilled, able-bodied, minority ethnic, majority ethnic, resident, citizen, refugee, and remote learner. Where do we begin such a process? Again, I would introduce the thinking of another classical civic sociologist of the era, W.E.B. Du Bois. In the early part of his career, Du Bois introduced the notion of the talented tenth, an intellectual elite present in every race, for whom a robust classical education should be organized. These gifted leaders would become the teachers and civic organizers of every community. In due course, this would lift the entire race up. Now, the elitism within Du Bois's position was criticized at the time and since, and Du Bois himself refined, revised, and clarified his initial standpoint in relation to this criticism over his lifetime. I would not therefore uncritically recommend the talented 10th position, just as I'm not suggesting we take on all of Arnold or Eliot's ideas without critical interrogation and reconstruction. But consider Du Bois's educational philosophy in relation to the debates he was involved in. Specifically, his more radical and intellectualist position was opposed to that of Booker T. Washington, who wanted to expand education and skills for the Black community so that they could enter jobs, then in time gradually improve their condition in a context where realistically they would be excluded from further opportunity. This was the South, the American South of the late 19th century. What Du Bois observed was that such skills-based and technical education would only be training Blacks to work for someone else. In this way, the Washington or Tuskegee model retained the racial hierarchy even while appearing to improve the condition of Blacks in America. In the short run, perhaps Du Bois's elitist position seems more exclusive, but in the long run, such an educational revolution would in due course touch the entire Black community in undiluted form. All would be able to consider themselves equals, would have access to the highest fruits of civilization and contribute to those. They would not satisfy themselves with those skills and tasks that external powers that be deemed them eligible for. Ultimately, Du Bois, like many women's suffrage campaigners and others at the time, insisted on a comprehensive and universal humanist vision of equality that could not abide the notion that anyone of any race could or should be excluded from full personhood. This meant full and complete access to culture, with all respective rights to change and mold that culture in one's image, just as white and upper-class elites did without a second thought. The radical democratic position became clearer in Du Bois's later writings as he moved away from the elitist talent and 10th focus on percentages and whatnot, recognizing, along with Houston, Woodson, and others, that desegregation was at least as important for removing the presence of parallel educational provisions according to race. But we might yet consider the curriculum Du Bois sketched as being necessary for intellectuals to situate themselves and their talents within a wider world, a deeper history, and a more profound moral consciousness. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop moneymakers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men we shall have only as we make manhood the object of the work of the schools. Intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and of the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of that higher education which must underlie true life. Setting aside the use of gender, use of man, manhood, and such like, there's a lot of that in those 19th century texts. It's worth repeating the specific knowledges Du Bois says are required to form, let's call them adults or citizens or simply fellow human beings. Intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and then the relation of us to it. Are technical skills and information absent from such curriculum? Most certainly not. But these are not the education's aim or telos. Rather, what Victorians in several nations called moral or civic education was the central purpose of both higher learning and common school education. The sociologist Emil Durkheim, for example, wrote about such civil ethics and similarly prescribed a curriculum that would be necessary for individuals to find their own paths within an increasingly complex modern society. If we wish to give our pupils some genuine objective knowledge of what man is really like, and not merely a portrait of how he was ideally conceived at some particular moment of history, we shall have to make him aware not only of what is constant in human nature, but also what element in it is irreducibly diverse. At present, our entire moral and education system is dominated by what Durkheim called the cult of the individual. We must learn to see this as just one of an infinite variety of moral systems in which human beings can self-organize themselves. Indeed, such a pluralistic vision of society is one logical conclusion of liberalism, even if in practice such a structure as practice precludes the development of genuine content, an integration of genuine variety or diversity, or indeed a fair and rational distribution of social products and goods. At what point do we stop whinging about neoliberalism and stop to ask ourselves whether it's liberalism writ large, liberalism as such, which may be the infernal source of our never-ending crises in economics, politics, and indeed higher education? What the classical civic thinkers I identified argued, and for anyone familiar with the Victorian era, there are a great many others with similar views: John Ruskin, William Morris, Patrick Geddes, Thorstein Veblen, John Dewey, Emily Davies, Charlotte Gilman, Jane Addams, and on and on and on, who reckoned, I think rightly, that we mustn't concede our morality to the businessmen, the bankers, and their agents. Nor should we accept the organization of peace within the logics of never-ending war. We must fight to establish world peace in our time. We need to imagine what peace looks like, nor can we tolerate the domination and exploitation of Earth and its resources without regard for its inhabitants. We require new ways of doing, new ways of thinking, and not merely at the margins. Not merely upgrading our skills for employability across a range of vaguely defined sectors. Further, we must regain the confidence wherein we say to so-called experts and authorities using this kind of language that they're wrong, that it's actually a tragedy that such carriers of mediocre narrow discourse have made their way into positions of genuine power. And as a civilization, we need to stop the further enculturation of future generations in such inane, shallow, boring, immoral, uninspiring, unimpressive, homogeneous, and archaic forms of education. We must reconstruct knowledge, as Du Bois argued, from the top down, not because we're elitist, but because that is in fact the way the world realistically works. We do no one any favors, least of all those marginalized and disempowered members of our society, by pretending we are these anti-elitist elites who care about all of these social causes and do nothing about them. By doing so, we're handing the keys to the castle to the grifters, charlatans, and bullies. So well done. That's great. Instead, I think the tasks before us are manifold. We must reclaim, reorient, and reconstruct the university in the main. That is, so to speak, the supposedly elite culture exhibited at more or less the wealthiest institutions. At the same time, we must extend this new open and inclusive form of knowledge to 100% of the population. This is how we overcome the inflection point and move on to Universities 3.0, or maybe we can just call it the university. Here's a couple things we might consider doing. 1. Everyone needs to be able to access the system where it is most relevant and most accessible, that is, locally. This means removal of barriers due to particular standards and expectations. In particular age, there's no reason why we organize this institution around 18-year-olds. It's arbitrary. 3. Bachelor's level education needs to be regeneralized. Specialist training on apprenticeship models are very sensible. But we should have non-knowledge-based occupations working collaboratively with scientific disciplines. There's no reason to separate these specializations from one another. 4. Academic work should be public-facing, open, free, and accessible. We should fund the university, and then the university should provide knowledge freely as it's being developed. This means not held exclusively by fee-paying students. Student-teacher relationships would still exist, but they would be replaced by an apprentice-coach model of relation rather than the kind of consumer-producer model. 6. Knowledge work should be progressive, processual, and archived, not repetitive and mediocre. So this means new public lectures every year. Those would then become books or articles or whatever. There's no point of reproducing something that's already been said. There's only so many years in our lives. 7. Academics should be free to pursue multiple activities, some of which are oriented towards students and teaching, some of which are oriented towards research, some of which are oriented to impact, and these levels might fluctuate. But this doesn't improve by being managed from above, and in particular not by being managed externally with external metrics and so on. If more is needed for a particular issue, then that should be negotiated cooperatively and locally. Finally, I argue this should begin immediately. There's no point in waiting for government or economic changes. These are not coming. In any event, our civic educational ideals presuppose empowered agents taking control of their own lives in collaboration with a range of global and local communities. There is no future moment that will be better than the past or present to begin such active participation in life. Indeed, as we find ourselves emerging slowly from an external crisis wherein a tiny, inanimate organism has been enough to make the entire liberal world order come to a screeching halt, wherein we collectively, instinctively, and immediately put the lives and health of others ahead of the demands we contribute to pointless materialism, economic growth, and dysfunctional politics, surely now is the best of all possible times to begin reconstruction. Thank you.